Hello and welcome to episode 6 of Old Man Yells. I'm Bob Burnett of Barefoot Mining. Today I want to talk about scarcity. And probably when I say scarcity, most Bitcoiners instantly think about the 21 million limit on the money supply and all the things and benefits that absolute scarcity brings. Obviously, it's a very important part of what Bitcoin is and its value proposition. But there's a second scarcity inside Bitcoin that I don't think has been grasped by many, and that's block space. And as we go forward, I think we're going to see that there are massive implications and massive behavioral changes and economic incentives that are going to change within the community, within the ecosystem. To get a grasp on that, we have to do a little math first. I think most people think of blocks coming in every 10 minutes. That's actually not true. The average block time in the last year has been 9 minutes and 49 seconds. If you look at it over the entire life of Bitcoin, it's more like 9 minutes and 38 seconds, something on that order. But if we use that figure from the last year, we have 146 blocks, 146 and a half actually blocks per day. That extra 11 seconds actually makes a difference. And if we then extrapolate that to a year, 146 and a half blocks times 365 days, what we end up is 53,500 blocks per year. And if you think about it, that is an unchangeable number. The difficulty adjustment's always going to keep us right around that 10-minute mark. I think for the foreseeable future, we can expect it to run a little faster than that on average. And we really can't change it. So 53,500 blocks per year, that's it. The second thing is block size. And I don't want to go into gory details here, but typical block size is 2 megabytes. It has a theoretical max of 4 megabytes. If you look and study the transactions in the blockchain, you'll see that we're probably averaging 2,500 to 3,000. The practical limit consistently is probably more around 4,000. And as I think most Bitcoiners would agree, that is also unchangeable. And if you have doubts about that, I guess, read the block size wars, but I think that ship has sailed. So what we end up with is we have 53,500 blocks. We have 4,000 transactions per block. Do that math. And what we'll see is that there are about 214 million transactions that can be processed or run through the network in a given year. It may sound like a big number, but when you start kind of chewing down on that a little more, you realize that maybe it's not so much. There are 8 billion people in the world. If we reach a day when even just 10% of the people of the world own Bitcoin, that means there's 800 million people who want access to the base layer. And we only have just over 200 million max transactions that we can put through this system on an annual basis. So if we reach that point, only 1 of every 4 people can do even one base layer interaction annually. Now, realistically, we probably won't hit the max of 4,000 transactions. There'll be a few empty blocks mined. There'll be some large blocks mined. Maybe we're dealing more like 150 million annually as our top number. But regardless of what that number is, you can see that very quickly the proportion of transactions the network is capable of are grossly inferior to just the sheer number of users that the network will have. Because again, we were only looking at a case of 10% of the people. And also remember that going forward, it may not just be people who are users. There'll certainly be companies that are users. They'll probably even be bigger users than most individuals. And we'll have things, for instance, there is a distinct possibility that you'll see devices, artificial intelligence devices, automobiles, that essentially are users of the blockchain themselves. But if we go back to kind of the base number, we're at a point now where there is a distinct possibility that in the coming year, we're going to reach parity between the number of people using the network and the number of transactions. I think that number is probably going to be in the 120 to 150 million number. In other words, in, let's say, the next 12-month of calendar year from July 1st of 2023 to June 30th of 2024, maybe we have 125 million people interacting with the network, and we have 125 million transactions on the network. I've come up with something I've called the annualized block space access ratio. That's a little bit of a mouthful. Annualized block space access ratio. I'm calling that the ABSAR. And it's a new metric to track this number, which I believe will become a very important number for all of us to realize going forward. And it'll be essentially looking at what is the annualized transaction count divided by the number of Bitcoin users. And if you think about it over time, because the annualized transaction count has an upper bound, it's somewhere in the neighborhood of that 214 million number I talked about before. And the number of users, though, essentially can trend toward infinity. It means that the ABSAR score over time is going to trend toward zero. Again, number of transactions over the number of users. Number of users, the denominator is trending toward infinity, while the annualized transaction count has a very finite upper bound. So, that means that over time, block space is going to become wildly scarce and wildly expensive. And I don't think the average Bitcoiner has thought about this. Frankly, the Bitcoiners to date have been spoiled rotten. They've had access to the base layer almost at will for essentially free. And, there have been two reasons for that. The demand has been, on the whole, relatively low thus far. Plus, the subsidy has been doing what subsidies are intended to do, and that's act as a bridge to a period of time where the market takes over and itself takes care of the incentives. So miners, which obviously most of you would know, are securing the network. They have been, for the most part, paid through the subsidy, not through the fees. We sit at a time today where I think most people would know the subsidy is 6.25 Bitcoin. Less than 5 years from today, though, it's going to be 1.56. And less than 10 years from now, it's going to be under 1 Bitcoin, actually about 3/4 of a Bitcoin. And somewhere in that time frame, in the 5 to 10 year time frame, the subsidy, for all intents and purposes, is over. It no longer provides the economic incentive to the mining community. In my mind, the ABSAR ratio, which I talked about before, will cross under 1, meaning the number of transactions processed annually is now less than the number of users. And we will enter a world where the scarcity of block space will be just so apparent. In fact, I predict that within that 5-year period, we will see mining revenue be comprised of at least 2/3 from fees as opposed to 1/3 from subsidy. But sometime in the next 5 years that will happen. I'd say there's at least a 50% probability that that occurs during the next cycle, during the next halving epoch, which would be while we're at 3.125, but highly, highly likely that it occurs in the next one. And so typical users are going to find that on-chain movements are going to be really rare. They're going to be really expensive. You may not be able to do them or afford to do them quickly. Been a lot of talk because of, for instance, what's happened with Prime Trust, obviously all the stuff that's happened with Celsius and Voyager and all those sort of things. But I think there's a reality that there's going to be a need for custodial companies because people that don't have massive amounts of Bitcoin are not going to be able to move that Bitcoin back and forth with the base layer the way they have been. As I mentioned before, people have been very spoiled. You go spend $50 to acquire some Bitcoin and you move it onto the base layer. You have an S19 running and you get a payout of 100,000 sats and you direct it to cold storage. Those sort of things probably aren't going to happen. There's going to be a very important place in the ecosystem for some form of trusted custodial solution where people can aggregate wealth and only move it into the base layer when they really know that that money is going to stay there for a long period of time. Now we have a window left where it still is cheap and it still is accessible. And I can't say whether or not that's going to be months or a few years, but we're essentially at the end of the line. So if you've got scattered UTXOs, consolidate them. If you've got coin joins to do them. Don't hold tiny amounts of Bitcoin on the base layer. It doesn't make sense. They could actually get economically trapped. If you throw 50,000 sats into a unique location at the base layer, that could effectively get trapped because it may cost more in fees to get it out of there than even sits there. You need to think about these things. I don't think any of us can completely grasp all the ramifications of what's happening, but they're going to be big. And this idea of blockspace scarcity and the ABSAR ratio are going to be critical to planning your Bitcoin strategy going forward.